Gentlemen, we are live, coming to you from wherever we all are. Jonathan Fink, Chuck Pfarrer, and Timothy Ash, also known as Timothy Ash, is with us today. And as we were just saying off air, there's just so much to talk about. Jonathan, I'm going to let you say what you need. What you were talking about, maybe the whole Belgian assets and the money situation. Why don't we kick it off with that?
We'll get into that. That's a core topic, I think. But I just want to announce what I'm going to call this episode when the thumbnail uploads in a minute. Rewarding Russian terrorists is what I'm calling it, because it seems to me that in all this transactional discussion around the assets, the peace deal, etc., it seems that justice is not being mentioned at all. And the fact, how can you make a deal with a mafia regime, which is what Putin's regime is. Khodorkovsky's been telling us for years what it is. People like Zarina Zabrinsky and others who understand what it is say that you cannot make a deal with the mafia. And that seems to have been missed off everyone's agenda. Those are the things I wanted to bring up. And I think we've got great people to sort of address that in the room. But let's start with Belgium and the assets, because it seems that the pressure is all on Belgium to do the right thing. And yet when push comes to shove, the rest of Europe is not prepared to, how do you say it, socialize the risks or spread the risk of those assets. And Britain is not prepared to take the step of releasing unilaterally its central bank assets that it controls. Is this too simplistic? I'm going to chuck this over to Tim to start with. Is this too simplistic interpretation, or have I got it about right?
Well, look, let's look at the positives to start with, right? I mean, finally, we have acceptance by the IMF and the European Commission that there is this financing hole for Ukraine for 26, 27, and then to 29, right? So the fund estimates that the budget financing gap is $140 billion for the period, for the 4-year program that they're talking about from 26 to 29, right? And then the Commission, in its paper, in terms of provided, because the Belgians asked for it, in terms of the requirement, the funding gap from a total financing perspective for 26-27 is also 140 billion euros this time, right? So what we know is that Ukraine is underfunded, right? So that at the moment, given the Americans have stepped back, the rest of the world, or the Western Alliance, what's left of it, basically have to meet that shortfall, or Ukraine will be underfunded, not able to defend itself, could fail, and then we all know the costs to Europe will be catastrophic if that happens. As I've mentioned many, many times, tens of millions of Ukrainians moving west because they don't want to live in an authoritarian system, which is how this all started, I guess, in 2013, Euromaidan 2014. Actually, go back to Orange Revolution, if anything, for 04, 05, right? Ukrainians will not stay under Putin. They will leave. That will create huge political, social, economic pressures in Europe, massive increase in defense spending, probably an extra $1 trillion a year needed in defense spending. So that's the need, or that's the ask. So the European Commission figured out it had this problem. They went away, thought about solutions. In the end, the realization is European taxpayers probably not willing to fund that money. And I think morally, it's right that Russian taxpayers pay. I mean, guys like me and other people have been arguing it's the right thing to do. We have this money sitting in bank accounts doing nothing in Europe and everywhere else or lots of other places in the world. Why don't we utilize it to make Russia pay for the brutal war of aggression against Ukraine, the fact that it's breaking international law? Let's turn it around and use it to fund Ukraine, to help it buy weapons to defend itself and defend us, right? So anyway, the Commission came up with their preferred option was this reparation loan idea, something that I'd suggested over 3 years ago, but anyway, whatever. Anyway, they came up with this idea. Essentially, money sitting in Euroclear, this is the Belgian depository. There is a debt contract with the ECB in theory. That money is then used by Europe to fund a reparation loan to Ukraine. If Ukraine gets reparations from Russia, subsequently the money's paid back essentially, right? And everyone thought it was a great idea. The Belgians said, we hate this idea. They have spent the last 3.5 years lobbying against it. I mean, it was, I thought the irony today that the Belgian foreign minister was saying our voice has not been heard. Unfortunately, the Belgians' voice has been heard for the last 3.5 years, which is one of the main reasons why mobilized Russian assets have not been used already, right? So the Belgians, Euroclear, have been lobbying aggressively against it. But anyway, the Belgians said, we don't like it because what happens if Russia wins a legal case or lodges and wins a legal case in Belgium or other courts in Europe, and we have to pay the money back and the money's gone, it's in Ukraine. What happens then? Or what happens, for example, if the Europeans, they have this biannual sanctions rollover that keeps the assets immobilized? What happens if the Hungarians or the Slovaks block that process? Again, we would have to pay the money back in full. Fair enough, right? I mean, it's a risk. I think it's a low risk. It's a low risk because, there are two angles to that. It's very unlikely that Russia would lodge a lawsuit in Belgium, because to do so, it would have to lift its own sovereign immunity, and likely, Russia is on the cost. The damage to Ukraine is probably $1 trillion, right? So to defend its 330 billion, potentially it would leave itself open to cases looking for the $1 trillion. Interestingly, the assets under the reparation loan are not seized. They are simply retooled. The asset is still owned by Russia. It's a clever way of avoiding full seizure. And actually, I don't think there's much of a change in the move to reparation loan from what we have already in mobilization. And 3.5 years, Russia has not launched any lawsuits in Belgium on immobilization. So why would they on the move to reparation loan idea? But anyway, that legal action would probably take years and years, probably over 5 years. So I mean, the Belgians said, well, if it happens, where are we going to get the liquidity from? The European Commission hoped the ECB would provide that short-term liquidity, even with guarantees provided for this reparation loan. And the ECB and Lagarde kind of was missing in action this week and said, "Oh, we're not going to do that. We would break treaty obligations for doing that." I mean, the interesting thing about that is that one, as I said, any legal action is likely to be very long term, right? So, I think Europe would have some time to think about the possibility of losing an action in Belgian courts or European courts and getting its act together and finding the liquidity potentially to pay that back. And the other angle is the rollover of the sanctions and immobilization. Interestingly, there's a paper today, or a attempt by Europe to address some of the Belgian concerns, and it suggests that potentially there's an emergency ordinance in the European Commission kind of rules, etc., that potentially allows a move from unanimous voting on these issues to qualified majority voting, right? So that could potentially ensure that there was some surety in terms of the immobilization of the assets, that the sanctions wouldn't be lifted, and in theory the underlying assets would have to go back to Russia. So that's some kind of assurance. But as I said, I think the risks that Russia would launch a legal action and win that action in a European court, given that it's trodden on international law already and the assets have not been seized, I think is very low. I mean, I would say it's less than 10% probability. And as I said, it's not going to happen soon. It's going to take a very, very long time to adjudicate that particular ruling. So Europe's got lots of time to get its act together. Now, in terms of the guarantees, the other angle is, well, how about Europe indemnifying Belgium for a worst case scenario that in the end Russia launches a case, wins a case at some time in the future, and then Belgium's on the hook for the full 190 billion or whatever it is. Well, sure. I mean, I think in that case, Europe should pool the risk, right? I think it's fair for the European countries to say, fair enough. Belgium's holding the bulk of these assets. By allowing the transfer of these assets to be used to support Ukraine, this is a common good for Europe. We should all stand behind Belgium for that in that instance. I think there is probably agreement across Europe that happens. I should also say that I find it anyone arguing against it is a bit ridiculous if you think about it, because essentially the question or the decision point is this: either we say we're not going to use immobilized Russian assets, and we have to fund 140 billion, and so we have to spend the money now from our taxpayers, right? We have to go to taxpayers and say, sorry guys, we want to protect Russian central bank assets. We want to protect Russian taxpayer money at all costs, because we think that this money is so important to Russia that we have to defend their interests above everything else, and you're going to pay. And it's probably going to be the German taxpayer ultimately, but whatever. So anyway, the decision is taken to spend our taxpayers' money now, or we go with the reparation loan idea, or we go after immobilization. And at some point in the future, like I said, 5 years plus, there is a small probability that we lose the lawsuit, and then we have to pay the 140 billion back. It's a no-brainer, right? You will always take the risk with the immobilized assets and the reparation loan, because there's a high probability you won't have to pay it back. It's a dead cert that if we don't use the immobilized Russian assets, we have to spend our own taxpayers' money. I mean, it's idiocracy.
It's madness. They're not going to sue for multiples of that amount.
But anyway,
yeah.
I think I've probably said enough there to kick things off and stir people's emotions. So,
David, if I might jump in and just put a little sort of activist boot in there, it sounds to me like we might have a problem, the same problem that we have with the International Olympic Committee letting neutral Russian sports people play, the same issues we find eventually that Russia has secreted its assets, its agents, and its narratives and piped them into international institutions. Is Belgium just defending its national interests, or is it suffused with, dare I say it, agents of the Kremlin? Well, here's one for Chuck.
Well, there is no question that there is one portion of this war where Russia is dominating, and that is in terms of information warfare, in terms of accentuating any news event or point of information that polarizes Europe or the United States. They're very, very good at doing that. But and I'm more of a tactical and geopolitical guy. But I find a delicious example of this in that the four of us are now talking about the intricacies of European law when Russia acknowledges no law whatsoever, including their own. In the last 50 years, Russia has invaded. I don't know. Let me work backwards. Syria, Ukraine, Georgia, Chechnya twice, Moldova, Georgia. And with every one of those countries, they had solid security guarantees granted to each one of those countries. So very brief footnote in here. I'm going to listen to my economic betters, but I would just point that out. We are not quibbling. We are discussing law that Russia wouldn't recognize were the shoe on the other foot.
David's talking, but we can't hear. David, you're muted.
No, I'm not. But I understand what you're saying.
Here we go.
They're bad people. They don't believe in laws. They don't believe in law at all, international, their own law. And we are quibbling, to use Chuck's accurate word, about whether or not they're going to sue the West, sue Belgium. I just want to add, Tim, you and I have talked about this issue a few times before. Are you in favor at this point, after all these years, of the Europeans, the EU, seizing the Russian assets? They're immobilized right now, and you actually schooled me on the difference of that a while back. Are you in favor of them seizing it now, or is there some distinction that that they should make rather than just out and out taking these frozen, immobilized Russian assets at this point?
Look, I'm part of a working group I'm an economist, but there's legal guys I work with, and there is this legal argument called countermeasures, right? And the legal case has been made for seizure. I buy it. It's this line that a country only benefits from sovereign immunity when it's in compliance with international law, right? And when countries are out of accordance with international law, their sovereign immunity lapses, and then countermeasures can be applied. That's sanctions, and you can basically seize the assets, and you can structure something like a reparation loan or something like that after seizure that could meet the requirements, I think, of international law. And I think seizing sends a very strong message, right, to Russia that there is a price attached to its bad actions, right? And actually, an argument is made against seizure that, well, what about other potential bad actors around the world, Chinese, etc. Would they, see this as a reason to pull their assets out of, reserve currencies, for example? I mean, my message there is, well, don't do the bad actions, right? I mean, if you're planning on invading another country and committing war crimes, well, maybe it's not a good idea if your assets are in Belgium and Euroclear, right? Maybe you would think twice about doing those kind of things. If there was this potential sanction that your foreign exchange reserves would be seized. So, we shouldn't be scared by this. And in the end, look, others on the call know more about this than I do. But look, in the end, what we've learned about Putin is he respects power and strength. You appease Putin, he walks all over you, right? And I think seizing would send an incredibly strong signal to Putin that we are serious, right? And, in the end, we've gone down the reparation loan route because, we haven't had leadership, frankly, in G7 by the Biden administration. They had lots of time to go down the seizure route. They and interestingly, there were people in the administration who were very supportive of moving to seize the assets. And in the end, Biden made the decision he didn't want to do that. That was a massive mistake. And then, unfortunately, because he didn't do that, we've been left hostage to the Trump administration, playing lots of different games around this. So, I'm a strong believer in seizure. I think there's a legal case to be made. I think it sends a very strong signal to Russia. And then we don't mess around with the intricacies now with the reparation loan. But look, in the end, we are where we are. I bought the reparation loan idea because I thought this is what the European Commission could get over the line. And in the end, needs must. Ukraine absolutely has this financing shortfall in 26-27. We have to fill it or Ukraine loses. Time is of the essence. Our bureaucrats have wasted 3.5 years on this, doing nothing. And that's a travesty. I mean, the number of times I've met British politicians or MPs, and you talk to them and you say, or German politicians or whoever it is, you explain to them, look, we can either use Russian taxpayer money to fund Ukraine, or we can use your own taxpayer money to fund Ukraine. I mean, it's that simple. And it's like a eureka moment. It's like, oh my God, Tim, what a fantastic idea. Why don't we do it? And, in the UK, I mean, I've spoken to Labour Party guys, Conservatives, Liberal Democrats, Scottish Nationalists, Liberal, you name it. They all support it. They go away and they say, this is a fantastic idea. What do we need to get it done? And then it gets stuck in the Bank of England or Her Majesty's Treasury, whose job is to think about ways to not do things like this. And as I've said, the ECB, the British Treasury, the French Treasury, the German Treasury, this is a national security issue, right? It's not a finance issue, actually, right? And, Putin thinks he's at war with us. I mean, that's the reality. And we are in a war with Russia. I mean, that's the reality. He's waging war on us. And, this is about survival. It's an existential threat to our way of living, our way of governance, right? And you need to do extraordinary things. And I think, the ECB, UK Treasury, they just didn't really get it, right? And really, it's about leadership. It's about the guys at the top of our political systems, that's the prime ministers and presidents, telling treasuries and central banks to get this done. I mean, again, Lagarde at the ECB, she's come up with all these reasons why the ECB can't provide the liquidity backstop for the reparation loan. Why is she making that determination, right? Does she know the scale of the national security risk to Europe from Russia? And what happens if this doesn't happen? As I said, the bigger risk to the euro and the stability of European financial markets and confidence in European financial markets is not if we immobilize or we seize these assets. If we don't, Ukraine loses, Europe massively loses. Again, the financial cost, the economic cost to Europe will be extraordinarily large for many years to come. I mean, the $1 trillion extra defense spending I mentioned is per year, right? It's not a one-off, so imagine the impact of the euro of that. It will be higher budget deficits, higher borrowing costs, higher interest rates, lower growth, and a weaker euro. So I don't get what planet Lagarde is on, but she's certainly not showing any leadership on this issue.
I brought this up on the screen, David, because I thought you'd like it. We had a comment in Russian, which was being kindly translated by one of the people in the audience. And the basic idea of it is that that Trump is acting, he put it as a protege, I'd say more as to the benefit of the Kremlin. And this is one of the key issues. There seems to be a number of different sort of elephants in the room that, unless we tackle them, are going to be a problem. And I like to, push this Chuck's way. One of those delusion points is that Trump is anything but aligned with the Russian narrative. We see this coming out in the peace process. The other delusion here seems to be that we are dealing with a sovereign government and a statesman in the person of Putin, someone who will negotiate in good faith, which he won't, will sign a document that he then adheres to, which he won't, and is looking for the same kind of things. In Khodorkovsky's words, we are dealing with someone who emerged from the mafia period of the 90s. We're dealing with a terrorist. And we used to have the mantra, never talk to terrorists, let alone reward them. That seems to be what's going on, though.
Yes, absolutely. And so transitioning from the last time I spoke, we see Putin engaging, big air quotes, in negotiations. In fact, his maximalist demands have only hardened. He said in his own words yesterday, we're not making any compromises. But interestingly, Italy judged that negotiations are still ongoing. Therefore, it's going to slow down any military aid it was planning to give to Ukraine. Here's another elephant that is in the room. Ukraine actually projected power into Russia, as we all remember, in Kursk Oblast. Washington unilaterally pulled the plug on all intelligence product given to Ukraine. That enabled Russia and North Korea to take back the Kursk Oblast. That was a total giveaway by the United States. I do try to avoid the third rail of American politics because I'm trying to be a big tent guy for Ukraine. But that alone, that fact that it happened to Ukraine, means that Ukrainian war planners cannot go on the offensive, even though there are opportunities right now, ironically, in Pokrovsk. Russia's lost almost 200,000 people just since Avdiivka and the 20 months it took them to go 25 miles to Pokrovsk. A lot of military analysts say that Russian force in Pokrovsk, although it's still advancing somewhat, it is culminated. It's hollowed out. It's ready for a punch. But Ukraine cannot take offensive operations because on a whim, Washington can cut off their intelligence again. And that would lead to rather the loss of a city, but a military catastrophe. So that stands against everything I thought my country stood for. Ukraine didn't start this fight. Russia did. Ukraine has not destroyed 100 Russian cities. Russia has destroyed 100 Ukrainian cities. So for me, as all of you have said, we can't trust anything that Russia says. They have violated virtually every agreement they have signed in the last 50 years, including the Biological Weapons Convention. Bucharest declarations, 3 or 4 guarantees of Ukraine's territorial integrity and national sovereignty. That means nothing.
Chuck, I want to follow up on what you said, and since I don't give a damn about what they think about me in the U.S. government, I'm just going to say that I mentioned off air that I'm officially, for what it's worth, coming out and say that Trump is a Russian asset, whether he's on the books, whether he has been formerly, whatever you want to say. He's a Russian asset. And if for no other reason, by the actions he's taken, especially since January 20th, when he was inaugurated again for his second term. I'm doing a podcast on that later today, but there's just a whole list of things that if the American media, especially, just looked at them, didn't brush them aside and go crazy with all the sideshows that Trump is coming up with to divert attention from that, it would be very, very easy to see that, my God, if he's not a Russian asset, then he's a much better actor than we all thought he was, but he's not a good actor. He's full of you-know-what. He is a Russian asset. Virtually every statement he's ever made and virtually all the actions he's taken vis-a-vis Ukraine has been for the betterment of Putin, to advance the Russian line. So, yeah, he is a Russian asset. And the fact that so many Americans, tens of millions of Americans, still love him. They don't just like him. They are passionately devout supporters of Donald Trump. Just makes me sick, to be honest with you.
Well, the United States has, regardless of the administration, and this goes back to President Obama, we've not been a friend of the United States. When the hybrid war was gearing up and thousands of Ukrainians were being dispossessed, unhoused, killed in battle, President Obama sent Band-Aids and blankets. Especially the national security apparatus under President Biden, they did Russia, they did Ukraine no favors as well. But I certainly see, David, how you've come to that conclusion. I see the same things you do. And again, look, this hurts Ukraine. And for me, the Kursk debacle, that was the Rubicon, right? I get asked a lot, why doesn't Ukraine do so and so and so and so? They can't. They have to look over their shoulder. We are the least dependable ally, and I wouldn't say ally, that they have. And, the United States.
I have to add, Chuck, because you and
Sure.
I agree on this too, as you being, of course, a former military member, a SEAL. It hurts me very, very deeply to say that I now include the United States of America as one of the countries that can no longer be trusted, to support its allies. It can be trusted to support Russia, but it cannot be counted on, trusted to support its allies. And for someone that served in uniform, put their life on the line, if called to do so, this pains me to no end. It makes me sick.
Now, I've got a question that leads on from that for both Tim and Chuck. And I think this is an important one. We've talked about the failure to seize the assets, the failure to face that reality of why it's kind of necessary and the potential cost of European taxpayers. But we had a comment in the channel here that said, well, what? Does that mean there'll be no peace deals ever, based on what we're arguing? And I tried to make the point, but interestingly, YouTube rejected it. Didn't like my comment. I don't know if it's been infiltrated by a Russian-aligned thing, because there's no swearing. It's very, very polite. But what I basically was suggesting here, and actually this has a military angle, it has an economic angle, because it has to be backed up from both of those perspectives. The question then becomes, how do we gain peace? How do you deal with Putin, understanding what he is? My suggestion here was you have to bookend any process, firstly by deploying massive force via Ukraine to convince Putin that there is no circumstance in which he can possibly win. And then the second one is to deploy such massive resources that he understands that he has no quarter to break any agreement, even if it's a contingent agreement or agreement to pause the front line. Now, there are military implications for Chuck to comment on, but Tim, there are massive financial implications. So where maybe, almost nitpicking about 140 billion, when in fact, if we're going to resolve this and protect European security, we're probably looking at a far larger bill in properly dealing with Putin or dealing with the consequences of him potentially attacking Europe in the years to come. All of those come with a massive price tag.
Yeah, look, I mean, I did think that whoever won the US election, there would be a peace process, right? I think both sides late last year were kind of thinking about it, and waiting to see the outcome of the election, right? I mean, I think Ukraine thought a Harris win would improve their position. I think Putin thought a Trump win would improve his position. But and in the end, I thought, Putin, Freudian slip. Putin, I think in the end, again, this idea that he respects power and strength, I think we had to increase the costs to him of continuing the war, right? Cost militarily, which, I would assume the Harris presidency would have increased military support Ukraine to increase the military losses for Russia of continuing the war. But then also maxed out on sanctions and obviously going after mobilized Russian assets is part of that process, right? To change Putin's calculus, to make him realize that he's not going to get anything more from continuing the war, and the West is united. And I think a deal could have been worked out, right? In my mind. And in the end, the Trump presidency came in. Trump, I think, just wanted a quick deal, and in the end gave away everything right at the start, right? I mean, made it absolutely clear to Putin, that he gave away all the negotiating points, right? No NATO, no security guarantees. Russia keeps all the territory it gets, returns to international markets, sanctions are off. I mean, the Russians couldn't believe their luck, right? And then Putin figured out, well, actually, I can outlast these guys. They are idiots, and I just play hardball, and in the end, the West collapses, and Trump delivers everything I want, right? So, but I think we're still in the same place. I mean, I think in the end, to get a fair deal for Ukraine, you have to max out the pressure on Russia militarily and from a financial perspective. There's lots more we can do from a sanctions front. Again, immobilize Russian assets. What a message that sends if you think about it, right? I mean, we are gonna take 330 billion away from Russia, and we are gonna give it to Ukraine so they can buy weapons. I mean, it buys a lot of weapons, right? I mean, that's a couple of years of funding. It tells the Russians that the Ukrainians are not going anywhere for 2 years, and they can cause a lot of damage, right? And I think the Russian economy also late last year was looking increasingly vulnerable. Growth was slowing, inflation was rising. There were some strange decisions from the central bank, and then obviously Trump came, and there was a bit of relief. But actually, interestingly, the Ukrainian actions now, if you look at the attacks on the oil refinery sector in particular, I mean, some of those hits by the Ukrainians, deep strike hits on on Russia's economic infrastructure are having an impact. The Lukoil Rosneft sanctions, finally, I mean, to give Trump some credit, I mean, actually, that was a seismic move, and we are seeing the impact now in terms of there's been a collapse of Russian energy export revenues, right? I mean, the news. Despite everything that Trump's doing, the Russian economy is not in a great place. It is getting more difficult for Russia and Russians, and we can further tighten the noose relatively easily, right? Actually, we should be doing that again to force Putin into serious negotiations to deliver a deal that, in the end, ensures that Ukraine is sustainable long term, so sustainable, successful, and actually economically self-sustaining, that it can fund its own defense, right? I mean, again, we can maybe talk about the elements of a peace deal, but I've long argued that NATO membership is great, but actually the best assurance of Ukraine's defense is itself, right? It has fought valiantly for 3.5 years. Despite our underfunding and our drip feed of military equipment. I mean, if we guaranteed them like a state of Israel kind of support, we guaranteed to give you the full range of top-notch conventional military kit, short of nuclear, right? So you can outgun Russia. You don't need necessarily 600,000 troops or 800,000. I mean, if you have a high-tech, top-of-the-range NATO military kit, you can, still porcupine idea, right? And that's what we should be aiming for. And actually, the 330 billion of CBR assets could help deliver that, right? I mean, they could help fund, Ukraine's, its its upgrading of its military capability to a point that it outguns Russia.
Yeah,
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah, Chuck.
I was just going to add, Russia is advancing, but they still control less territory than they did in 2022. So many people think Russia is just thrashing Ukraine. Here's an interesting little statistic. Come January, Russia will have been fighting Ukraine longer than it fought Nazi Germany. In Pokrovsk alone,
which is only 45 kilometers or so from Donetsk, not far from where they set out, in fact.
Exactly. And here's another little nugget. Just in Pokrovsk, every month, Russia loses more people than they lost in 10 years of fighting in Afghanistan. Russia is, and incidentally, every time there's a contact between Russian and Ukrainian forces, the Russians lose between 40 and 100% of the attacking force. And here's something that is quite counterintuitive. The larger the force Russia sends against Ukraine, the larger their loss ratio, right? The more tanks they put on open ground, the more tanks they lose. Okay, I want peace, right? I'm not one of these guys that says, let's fight to the last Ukrainian. That's not what I'm saying. But you can't trust a Russian peace agreement. They've already 3 times codified their respect for Ukrainian sovereignty. You just can't do it. And as Tim said earlier, Putin only speaks one language, and that is the language of violence. I will also say this. Every dictatorship, whether it's Saddam Hussein, Pol Pot, Caligula, they appear monolithic until the moment they fall apart. And I'd also like to mention this. There have been several irregular transfers of power in the history of Soviet Union and Russia. Look, there was a coup against Beria after he emerged as the leader on the death of Stalin. Khrushchev found himself coup d'etat out of a job by Brezhnev. And Gorbachev went down to the Black Sea and found out that he had been overthrown as well. So, Putin is hollowing out his economy, as Tim said. Lukoil has fallen. Their ability to make money in petrochemicals is down. And like any other tyrant in any other situation, once the Praetorian Guard, in this case, Putin's oligarchs, maybe not the security apparatus, but certainly the oligarchs, when they feel their future, their well-being, their untold billions are threatened, it's possible, I don't think likely, but possible that they'll move against Putin. But that's just on the table.
You and I have talked about this a lot before. In fact, one of the podcasts with you, I think, was entitled "Russia is Losing the War," because the overwhelming mantra, even out of the West, is that Ukraine is losing the war. Certainly the mantra out of the Kremlin. Let me ask you this. Putin very recently, I think yesterday, made another ludicrous statement about how he is prepared to go to war with NATO, with Europe. He doesn't want to, but he's prepared to do that. Let me ask you a strictly military logistics question. With all the other bickering and shortfalls that's going on with NATO right now, how is their logistics situation, specifically their ability to send reinforcements to whatever hotspots may happen in the eastern flank? It's not a secret that a lot of their roads and bridges and infrastructure is not in the best possible shape that it could be. Have they been addressing that issue fast enough and with enough resources?
No, they haven't. When UK Defense Intelligence put out that it assessed it was 18 months ago, that Russia is using 90% of its military capability in Ukraine, I didn't agree with that. But we do see now, for example, Russia is down to 50% of the air defense capability it had before the war. So what does that mean? Well, their S-400 systems, their Patriot equivalent, they've lost 55% of them. And in terms of, let's take what UK Defense Intelligence has demonstrated to me, although I would reluctantly believed at first. You look at Russian battlefield frontline point of contact logistics, I see donkeys, I see motorcycles. They've lost 15,000 trucks just in the last 6 months, right? So Mr. Putin may be ready to take on NATO, and I think he probably is if he's 75 stories underground in a granite outcropping. Yeah, he might be able to do it, but a war with NATO would end up just like Desert Storm. First, absolute air dominance would be placed over Ukraine. It would expand outward, and that would basically be the end of it. I see that as highly unlikely, but he says these, again, every time he speaks, it is designed to polarize. It's designed to take a gray situation and put it into stark black and white and force people to choose. And I always say to listeners, whenever you hear a Russian pronouncement, think, who is saying this and what do they want me to believe?
I was going to jump in because I think this is another interesting question. So Ukraine, throughout this war, has tended to understand that if you act in an entirely predictable fashion, that is triggering for Russia because they see you as weak. If you do not show force, you are seen as weak and you encourage more aggression. In the last week, we've seen the extraordinary sight of 2, possibly 3 grey fleet tankers heading towards Russia, well, 2 heading towards Russia. I think Novorossiysk. Another one was, somewhere around the other side of the world, and they've been taken out in curious circumstances, reputed to be mines, but more likely sea babies. Is this, and I'm not used to the escalation word because that's entirely inappropriate to apply to Ukraine, is this a ratcheting up of pressure on Russia to try to convince them, or for the Ukrainians to try to convince them that they cannot win, they cannot patch up their economy and their grey fleet, and frankly, it's over? We've also seen targeting, of course, of the key Russian ports and infrastructure as well. Not enough to take them out, but enough to give them the signal, look, that this is coming and they need to think seriously about negotiations. Tim, is this a new front that's opening up? Is this one in which Ukraine has a chance of plugging the gaps that the Western oil sanctions have not been able to?
Yeah, I mean, those attacks were kind of interesting, right? I mean, they hit empty tankers or freight in Turkey's economic zone, right? I mean, the Turks weren't actually too enthusiastic about it, right? They were quite annoyed by it. And then also, interestingly, they hit CPC, right? The Caspian Pipeline Consortium moorings at Novorossiysk. They hit one of the moorings. There are 3. Again, the Kazakhs,
they're hitting Druzhba as well over and over, aren't they? Which is that part of the same network? Yeah.
I mean, my sense, they were high risk, to be honest, from a Ukrainian perspective, from a diplomatic perspective. The Kazakhs have played a delicate hand during the war, or whatever. I mean, they've not gone out of the way to help the Russians. They try to keep a neutral hand and try and stay within compliance with sanctions. I mean, unfortunately, 80% of Kazakh exports go through Novorossiysk, and those exports are to Europe, and they're an alternative to Russian exports. So, I think that particular hit, and I think the attack on those tankers, they were more symbolic. I mean, I think in a way it related more to Steve Witkoff's trip to Moscow. The Ukrainians, I think, were saying, look, we've got agency, right? We don't like this. We don't like this process. There's a lot of stuff we can do. We can escalate. We can have impact on global markets. If you guys do stuff that, doesn't bear our interests in mind, right? So I think that was more those specific this week hits. As I said, they risked annoying countries that are somewhat supportive to Ukraine, right? Particularly Turkey is, and Kazakhs and Central Asia, etc. But I think the deep strike drone attacks by Ukraine against the oil refineries have been incredibly successful, right? I mean, they have shown that Ukraine can hurt Russia. They've taken perhaps 20% of Russia's refined oil production out. They have caused shortages domestically. They brought the war home to ordinary Russians, the queues, and they've increased prices, right? And they forced Russia to do some difficult things, which has been, they've been forced to try and export more crude. They can't process the crude at home because they've lost the refinery capacity. They have to export more crude, so they have to take lower prices for it. So the Ukrainians have been very clever in a lot of the stuff they've done, and they can do a lot more. I guess their constraints, their domestic deep strike capability, it's a scale, it's a manufacturing and a finance issue, right? I mean, if you look at some of the, some of the deep strike drones now, I mean, their success rate, has been quite, well, in general, they've been relatively low. There are a couple of variants that seem to have a very high strike rate. The challenge for Ukraine and the challenge for its partners is to where Ukraine has been successful in some of this military technology, to help them to get to scale quickly, and that's about finance. It may not be useful or to produce it in Ukraine. You may want to produce it offshore. Obviously, the Danes and the Dutch have done quite a lot of interesting stuff. The Turks could be very helpful again in helping them get manufacturing scale. I mean, when you talk these deep strike drones, it's relatively, it's mid-range manufacturing capability, right? I mean, often it's like manufacturing a car in many ways, right? Or a bit more complicated than that. But the science is in the software and the optics and all those kind of things. But producing the frame is relatively easy and straightforward, right? And again, we need to be clever, right? We could actually, interestingly, use some of these immobilized Russian assets to help finance getting Ukraine to scale in some of this deep strike drone technology. But again, we're not that clever, right? I mean, we don't do the obvious things.
Tim, where are we at with secondary sanctions? Have enough pressure been applied to that? I know that Russia's still getting spare parts and selling their oil and gas. Where's that at with the secondary sanctions?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, we can do more. I mean, more the Shadow Fleet sanctions. Obviously, the Ukrainians took things into their hand, as was mentioned already, by some hits on those Shadow Fleet tankers. Again, that increases the risk to those individuals. More people need to go to jail. More people need to get fined for helping Russia break sanctions. We haven't done enough of that. Interesting. I mean, there's been some kind of interesting angles going on recently. I mean, if you look at, for example, Serbia with the NIS refinery. I mean, I struggle sometimes to understand the Trump administration in lots of different areas, right? So, I mean, Orban got a exception, right, in terms of the Druzhba pipeline and continuing oil deliveries. He went to the White House. He said what he needed to say, and and the Trump guys, allowed them a carve out to continue to receive supplies from the Russians. Interestingly, the Serbs are also significantly reliant on oil supplies from Russia, and then it's processed at this NIS refinery that's owned by the Russians. The US has not given a carve out, and actually the Serbs are in a bit of difficulty now. They are having to try and they stopped receiving oil from the Russians, and actually it's going to have a major issue, a major break on the Serbian economy. I can't, obviously, if you think of Orban and Vučić in Serbia, are very similar MAGA-style politicians in many respects. I don't quite understand how Orban got a carve out, Vučić didn't. I know some of the Trump guys have business interests in Belgrade. Maybe they're not going as the way they'd want to go, and maybe there's maybe that's linked here. But ultimately, maybe the Serbs are not cooperating as perhaps some in the Trump administration would like. But more of that stuff. More doing what actually they're doing with Nish, right? Cutting Russia out of the energy supply chain, but there's lots more we can do.
And I've got another one here for you guys. Again, it's a quasi-military and economic question. we had this extraordinary statement by Caroline Leavitt, who is the mouthpiece of the Trump regime, coming out and saying, well, you know what? Selling weapons to NATO, this can't go on forever, i.e. selling weapons at a profit. If there's one thing that can go on forever, it's the US selling weapons at a profit, creating American jobs. So what is going on with this one? Because surely one of the things which would encourage Putin that he could continue his aggression against Ukraine and Europe is the idea that the US would no longer support Europe, not just with intelligence, which costs them money, but with weapons which they make money on. Let's put this to Chuck first, and then Tim, because I'm a simple chap. I'm not an economist, but that statement seems to deny all economic logic in my mind.
Well, 75 years of American foreign policy. The United States, and when I was a boy, it was thumped into my head that we were the arsenal of democracy, and that the unique characteristics of America's resource-rich and labor-rich environment, that we could provide the weapons that our allies, which I still consider to be our allies, need to defend themselves in Europe. And my early career was as a Cold Warrior, right? That in the days when Russia, the Soviet Union, outnumbered NATO forces 10-1, and that the war plans that I was involved in basically had the war sweeping the Allies back into the English Channel and us re-invading exactly like World War II. But it's alarming to even get a whiff of apparently a cabal in the United States thinking, well, we might not make a profit and sell weapons forever to Europe. Somehow we're going to prioritize the interest of a plutocratic cell in the United States, real estate developers and other people allied with the president, so they can make money in Russia. I don't want to think that. It's like discovering your mother is a hatchet murderer. But I could see how David has come to those conclusions. Perhaps I'm just a little too naive. I ate a little bit too much apple pie, and maybe I love my country too blindly. But Jonathan, your point is taken, and I can't refute it.
Yeah, maybe I'd just add, look, the economics and I guess military angle of supplying arms to Ukraine is a no-brainer in my mind, right? The bulk of the US financing for Ukraine already has been made up for is military kit from the Americans, right? That creates jobs. It's either old kit that's was in storage that was going to be destroyed, whatever, or it's newly manufactured kit. But in the end, it's been creating jobs for the US. And Russia surely is a long-term military competitor or threat or adversary for the US. The cost benefit of giving or supplying this kit to the Ukrainians to destroy the conventional arsenal of a adversary and competitor, it's without any US lives on the line. It's absolute no-brainer, right? And then now this angle of, okay, fair enough that Trump wants paying for it. Well, also, Europe and Ukraine wants to buy kit, right? And if we give them the $330 billion, they'd have a huge checkbook to be able to buy US kit, and that's jobs, right? That's jobs in the US, right? So I don't really understand why the US is not willing to continue to support Ukraine from a military perspective, and especially if the Ukrainians and the Europeans are willing to buy weapons. And actually, the whole way that the US, this administration views Europe, look, I think obviously he views Europe as weak, as Trump clearly doesn't like the European Union anyway. But the reality is, I think after J.D. Vance's visit to the Munich Security Council, the Europeans finally got it right, that the US backstop is not there. We're on our own. Our best defense is the Ukrainians holding out as long as possible, and then the Americans selling us weapons until we get our own autonomous defense capability, right? So firstly, Europe is this huge captive market for European military kit, right? And Europe is a big economy, 27 trillion euros, more or less the same in dollars, right? So, and Europe is going to go from 2% of GDP defense spend to 3, 4, whatever it is, right? Each 1 percentage point is 300 odd billion in increased defense spending. And I'd say probably half of that is going to end up in the US. So there's this huge market. And then let's say eventually Europe does get its autonomous defense capability, and it will, because the Germans will focus on this and they'll rebuild factories, and we'll have that capability, right? So then actually Europe is then a potential huge and capable ally for the Americans against the Chinese, right? I mean, I can guarantee a message to J.D. Vance. Absolutely, Europe will get its own very capable defense capability in 5 to 10 years' time. And if you think you're going to be going to war for China, I would think you would want Europe as an ally. I don't think you'd want Russia, a $2 trillion economy that has crap military technology. I mean, you'd want Europe as an ally, and you're going out of your way at the moment to send a message to Europe that we don't want you, and I don't know what message you're sending, but, at Europe's time of need, which is now, because we face an existential threat from Russia, you're not there. So good luck, and apologies to our American friends on the line. I mean, I don't see, as a Brit and as a European, I don't see China as an existential threat to Europe and my way of life, right? I don't think it's number one anyway on the list. For me, Russia is number one, right? And I understand, I get the Americans that they think China is this number one threat. I get that, right? But unless the Americans help us out with our number one threat, Russia, good luck in 5 years or 10 years knocking on my door saying, sorry, folks, would you like to align with us in this future war with China? We're not going to be there. And actually, by then, we are going to be capable, and we could add value to the American military machine at that point in the future, I would think. So I think, Europe needs to be a bit clever in all this, right? I think we have agency, we have leverage. We need to telling the Americans that, we're a huge market for your weapons. We would like to be that market for many years in the future. And, we could be potential allies with you in the future against China. But we have this ask, and this ask is help us stop Russia.
And a quick response for both of you there is, by defeating Russia or really showing that they cannot win, does that provide a deterrence for China? Does it make them think, hang on a second, this is they're not the adversary we thought they were, and Russia is not the ally we thought they were. We better rethink our plans for whatever it is, global domination, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I have two answers with that. China is looking towards projecting power into the Pacific. And although Taiwan is under threat, I would remind our Chinese naval listening guests that the chance of you invading Taiwan and holding the Taiwan Strait for the time necessary for you to fight a war offshore, you're not there yet. You've got 4 aircraft carriers. Well, we have 22 Seawolf submarines, right? So let's just go another place here. I completely agree with every word Tim said. This is absolutely fundamentally counterproductive for the United States to embark on this absolutely reckless course of alienating our best allies, right? And it's absolutely foolish. But there's another thing I'd point out, strictly as a military man. Land warfare tactics are at an inflection point right now, right? Most people die on Ukrainian battlefields because they are killed by flying robots, right? It has democratized air support. In my day, I had to pick up a satellite phone. I'd talk to God, and an airplane would fly out of the sky and lay waste to my enemies. Now, a rifle squad pulls a drone out, sends it up, it reconnoiters the enemy, and it takes out a tank at 20 kilometers, right? So look, There are two armies in the world right now that are experienced in 21st century warfare, which differs absolutely from the wars I fought. Those are Ukraine in position one, and position two is Russia. So we're talking about America selling the tools to anyone, but the technique and the art of using those tools has changed. The U.S. has not closed that knowledge gap, right? Hammers are used in a different way on the battlefield. I bring this up because recently in the American publication Stars and Stripes, they had a headline: America drops grenade from drone in German maneuvers. Are you out of your mind? You dropped a hand grenade from a drone, and that's your number one story? Do you have any idea what's going on in terms of, battlefield tactics right now? When I was in, aircraft carriers had electronic warfare. Divisions had electronic warfare. Now, 4 guys in a fire team, they've got electronic warfare. So if the U.S. wants to find out that it is going to sell tools that are useful on the battlefield, they had better draw themselves closer to Ukraine or face the consequences.
Chuck, what you just described was the cutting-edge battlefield strategy in World War I. They used to drop hand grenades from Sopwith camels. So we've come a long way. Listen, last thing I'm going to say before we have to go is it's very easy to understand why America doesn't want to sell any more weapons or technology to Ukraine or Europe, even though we would make a ton of money off of it, because, now I'll say it again, Donald Trump is a Russian asset. He doesn't want anything that's going to hurt his best forever friend. And that's just the way it is. If you accept that fact, as difficult as it may be, all of that becomes very clear. Again, it pains me to say that, and I've only recently said that that's what I believe. I've held off for years, but the evidence is just overwhelming. And that's how I'm going to close out this live stream today for my comments.
And we've got lots of comments in there. We haven't got to all of the comments, so apologies for that. I think in particular, Sergei Onyushenko has been putting lots of great comments in there, and actually one of the questions I asked, I think, very much reflects something he had in the chat and posted in there as well. Last thing, I would encourage everyone to write letters to their members of parliament and their representatives, especially around the frozen Russian assets, emphasizing why this is so important for them, not just the domestic issues such as price of eggs, etc. I would suggest you don't just write to the Belgians either, write to leaders right across Europe, because ultimately, if this is going to happen, it's got to be a collective decision to sort of socialize the risk of that. And as Tim pointed out, it's a very, very tiny risk indeed compared to the immense upfront cost if we're not going to take that step. Massively grateful to everyone on this. Yes. We'll let you go for your dinner or lunch or whatever it is in your time zones. Thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thank you very much.